The grass was still wet when he found them. A September morning in 1922, somewhere on the outskirts of New Brunswick, New Jersey. A boy cutting through farmland on a shortcut he probably took every single day. The air was heavy, thick with damp soil and the smell of something he couldn't name yet. And then he stopped walking, because there were two people lying under a crab apple tree at the edge of a dirt road locals called De Russey's Lane, and the way they were lying there made his brain go quiet before it could tell him what he was seeing. The man was on his back. His hat had been placed over his face. Not knocked there, not fallen there, but placed. Set down with the specific intention of someone who wanted him covered. The woman was curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, one hand resting on his arm, the way you touch someone when you've stopped pretending you don't want to. All around them, scattered across the flattened grass, were pieces of paper. You could see handwriting on every fragment, sentences broken off in the middle of a word, thoughts cut apart and thrown, as though someone had torn through the middle of a conversation and scattered it to the wind. And then the boy saw the card, propped against the man's shoe, placed there with a care that turns your stomach once you understand what it means. The man's own visiting card, his own printed name, his own title, announcing him to whoever came next. Stop there for a second. Think about what that card tells you about the person who placed it. They weren't running. They weren't panicking. Two people were dead on a dirt road in the middle of the night, and this person crouched down in the dark and positioned that small white rectangle exactly where they wanted it. Steady hands. A clear idea of what the scene should communicate. The patience of someone who had something specific to say and had chosen this method, this moment, this careful arrangement of bodies and letters, and a man's own name against his own shoe, to say it. That card is the first thing you need to hold in your mind, because it never stops mattering. Every suspect, every theory, every argument made in a packed courtroom 4 years later circles back to those steady hands in the dark and the question of who they belonged to and what they had decided. The man was Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, 41 years old, rector of St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church in New Brunswick since 1909. Married to Frances Stevens Hall. He was the kind of minister that communities build quiet pride around. Educated, good with people, the sort of man who remembered your name and your mother's illness and your daughter's piano recital and asked about all three. His congregation trusted him. His marriage connected him, by law if not by blood, to one of the most consequential families in Somerset County. The woman lying against his shoulder was Eleanor Mills, 34 years old. Her husband Jim worked as the sexton at St. John's, maintaining the building where Edward Hall preached. Eleanor sang in the choir. She had a voice that people remarked on, the kind that fills a space without effort, that lands in your chest before your brain has processed the sound. Both had been shot in the head. Eleanor had also been silenced in a way that went beyond the bullet, the killer ensuring, with a brutality that investigators and historians have long pointed to as deliberately symbolic, that she would never sing again, leaving a gruesome testament to their rage on the grass beside her. Whoever arranged that scene was not acting on impulse. Impulse doesn't scatter letters for effect. Impulse doesn't position cards against shoes or arrange the symbolic removal of a woman's voice. This was expressive violence, designed to communicate, built to be read, constructed by someone who had thought about what they wanted to say and chosen the most irreversible possible way of saying it. That's what has kept people returning to the Hall Mills case for a century. It was never really a mystery in the conventional sense of having no apparent solution. The motive wasn't obscure. The relationships weren't secret. The people with the most obvious reason to want Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills dead were not strangers to anyone in New Brunswick. The mystery was always about something else, about why the most obvious answers were never pursued seriously enough to matter, about what happens when the machinery that should deliver justice quietly decides, for reasons nobody states out loud, that some deaths aren't worth the cost of solving. To understand why nobody was arrested in the fall of 1922, you need to understand what one name meant in that city. In New Brunswick, the name Stevens was more than a surname. It was a shield. Frances Hall was born Frances Stevens, and her family had held property and political influence in New Jersey long enough that their name functioned like weather, something you didn't argue with, something you planned around. They sat on the boards of institutions that mattered. Their legal difficulties had a way of resolving before they became embarrassing. Their social position was maintained not through any particular drama, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small deferences made by 100 different people over many years. When Edward married Frances in 1911, he married into that protection without perhaps fully understanding what it meant or what it would eventually cost him. And when he was found dead on Russey's Lane in September 1922, the protection didn't disappear because he did. It transferred entirely to Frances. Because now the question wasn't about a dead minister. It was about whether Somerset County officials were willing to move against the Stevens family in a murder investigation. And in New Brunswick in 1922, that was not a question with an obvious yes. Somerset County Prosecutor Azariah Beekman was 70 years old, partially deaf, and had been elected to office in a county where serious violent crime was genuinely rare. His career had consisted largely of the ordinary legal friction of prosperous rural life, property disputes, minor criminal matters, the kind of work where preparation and seniority matter more than aggression and instinct. Nothing had prepared him for a high-profile double homicide. Nothing about his position gave him the insulation he would have needed to pursue this particular case against this particular family. He arrived at Russey's Lane on September 16th and found a disaster already in progress and already irreversible. Word had spread through New Brunswick with the speed that bad news always travels in a city where everyone knows everyone. Hundreds of people came out to the crabapple tree. They walked through the scene without restriction, stood around the bodies, picked up fragments of the torn letters as keepsakes. Someone stripped bark from the tree to take home. The footprints that might have placed specific people at the scene were gone within hours, trampled by the feet of people who had no idea what they were destroying. The visiting card was handled by multiple people in the chaos, passing through civilian hands before it reached anyone with authority. A reporter was involved at some stage, though who found it first and who passed it where has never been definitively settled. What is settled is that by the time anyone with investigative responsibility had a clear look at the scene, there was almost no scene left to look at. This was not a natural disaster. It was a failure of will, or of authority, or perhaps of both. The particular failure that happens when the people who should act understand, without being told, the limits of what they're expected to do. Beekman questioned the obvious people. Frances Hall gave him a calm, organized account. Home that evening. Went looking for Edward when he didn't return, stopped briefly at the Mills house, spoke to Jim Mills, went home without finding her husband. She was composed and cooperative and offered nothing that constituted evidence. Jim Mills was cooperative and appeared genuinely shattered. Church members offered nothing useful. Within weeks, the investigation had effectively stopped moving. Frances Hall remained in the Stevens family home. She continued attending church, continued her social commitments, continued existing in New Brunswick as she always had. And New Brunswick, for the most part, extended to her the courtesy of pretending this was normal. The whispers never stopped. But whispers stay whispers when the person they concern has enough family and enough history and enough of the right people's reluctance on her side. For years of that, for years of a murdered minister and a murdered choir singer unavenged in plain sight of everyone who had ever known them. Then the tabloids arrived, and the whispers became screaming headlines. The New York Daily Mirror in 1926 was a Hearst paper in serious trouble. It had launched in 1924 and was hemorrhaging money, struggling to compete with the Daily News in the brutal New York tabloid market. Her solution was the kind of story that couldn't be ignored, the case that made people reach for the paper before they had their coffee. The Hall Mills murders, cold for 4 years, had every element the Mirror needed. Wealth, religion, sex, murder, unsolved. A powerful family apparently shielded by their position. A dead choir singer with passionate love letters. The paper assigned a full team of reporters and committed to covering it as their signature campaign. The reporting was relentless and it was targeted. Phil Payne, the Mirror's managing editor, understood that the story needed new information to justify the coverage, not just a retelling. His reporters fanned out through Somerset County, talking to people who had never been formally questioned, following threads that Beekman's 1922 investigation had never picked up. What broke the political dam entirely was Louise Geist. She had worked as a maid in the Hall household in 1922 and was now navigating a bitter divorce from a man named Arthur Real. Real, looking for leverage in the proceedings, filed annulment papers that contained buried within their legal language a claim extraordinary enough to stop people mid-sentence. That Louise had told him she witnessed the Hall Mills murders. That she had been at de Russey's Lane that night. That the Hall family had paid her afterward to disappear into silence. Louise denied everything. Said Arthur was lying to damage her in the divorce, weaponizing a secret she had never told him. But the Mirror already had the story in print, and the story was already being picked up by papers across the state and governorate. Harry Moore found himself facing a question with only one publicly acceptable answer. He ordered a fresh investigation. A special grand jury convened in Somerville. And in July 1926, 46 months after Eleanor Mills was killed on a dirt road in New Jersey, indictments were handed down. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, charged with murder. The trial that opened on November 3, 1926, in the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville was unlike anything New Jersey had ever hosted. More than 300 reporters filled the press section and overflowed into every available space. Western Union installed dedicated telegraph lines because the normal infrastructure couldn't handle the volume of dispatches. Newsreel cameras positioned outside every entrance. The public gallery filled before dawn each morning, with people who had slept in their cars for the chance to watch. Hotels in Somerville sold out. The Hall Mills trial was, for 5 weeks, the most watched event in the country. Francis entered the courtroom each morning in dark, conservative clothing and took her seat with an expression that stumped multiple experienced journalists trying to describe it. It wasn't defiance exactly, but it also wasn't fear. One reporter wrote that she looked like a woman attending a meeting she found mildly beneath her, present because presence was required, but fundamentally unmoved by the proceedings. She sat through testimony about her husband's affair, about her own alleged presence at the murder scene, about the roles of her brothers, with a consistency of composure that eventually stopped reading as strength and started reading as something more deliberate. A decision made years before the trial started. Henry Stevens sat quietly beside her. A sportsman, a fisherman, a man who had spent the years since the indictments in Lavalette, away from New Brunswick, as close to invisible as someone charged with murder can manage. He had the bearing of a man who would have preferred to be anywhere else, but had long since accepted that there was nowhere else to be. And then there was Willie. Willie Stevens was 54 years old, and the press had spent the 4 years since the indictments constructing him into a very specific character. The eccentric bachelor brother who had never held a real job. The man who collected butterflies with the seriousness of a professional entomologist and built model trains in a dedicated room of the family home. The man who wandered New Brunswick at odd hours, knew everyone by name, had an encyclopedia knowledge of local history that he shared unprompted with anyone patient enough to listen. In a family defined by composed self-possession, Willie had always been the one who didn't quite fit the frame. Too odd, too untethered, too visibly strange to project the quiet authority that the Stevens name was supposed to carry. The prosecution had built its entire cross-examination strategy around Willie being the weak point. The theory was simple. This socially marginal, never quite adult man, put under real pressure by a skilled prosecutor with a murder charge to prove, would lose his footing. He would contradict himself. He would become confused or frightened or say the thing that unraveled everything his sister had spent 4 years holding together. The courtroom leaned forward when Willie walked to the stand. This was the moment. The prosecutor began carefully, establishing a timeline for the night of September 14th. Willie answered each question with a specificity that nobody in the room had expected. He placed himself precisely, consistently, at specific locations at specific times. When the prosecutor pressed him on details, Willie didn't deflect or generalize. He elaborated, with the patience of someone who had apparently cataloged every relevant moment of that evening years ago and was now simply reading from the catalog. The prosecutor tried a different approach, suggesting inconsistencies between Willie's current testimony and earlier statements. Willie identified each attempt before it landed and addressed it directly, not defensively, not anxiously, with the calm of a man who understood exactly what was being attempted and had decided in advance that it would not work. The cross-examination went on for hours. The courtroom, which had leaned forward expecting a collapse, slowly settled back. One reporter wrote that watching Willie Stevens testify was like watching someone perform a role he had been rehearsing for 4 years and had finally gotten exactly right. Another wrote that the prosecution looked genuinely unprepared, that they had brought a strategy built around a Willie Stevens who hadn't shown up. Before Willie took the stand, though, the prosecution had played what it believed was its most powerful card. Jane Gibson farmed pigs in Middlesex County, a few miles from DeRussey's Lane. She was in her early 50s, built by decades of farm labor, with the direct manner of someone who had spent their life without much patience for social performance. She had a long-established habit of riding her mule at night to check on her cornfields, which had been repeatedly raided. She claimed that on the night of September 14, 1922, that habit had taken her down to Russey's Lane at the exact moment when a murder was happening beneath a crabapple tree. Her account had been first given in 1922 and had become, across 4 years of retelling, progressively more certain and more detailed. She said she had heard voices arguing. She said she had seen a woman kneeling over a man's body. She said she had seen a heavy-set man with a mustache nearby. She said she had heard a woman's voice crying out, "Don't, don't, don't," before shots were fired. And she said she had seen faces clearly enough to identify them. The woman kneeling, Frances Hall. The heavy-set man, Willie Stevens. The newspapers had given her a name before the trial started. The pig woman. It was meant to be colorful. It came out as something that placed her, before she spoke a word, in a different social register from the Stevens family. She was brought to the Somerville courthouse on a stretcher, too ill with kidney disease to walk, and the prosecution arranged for a hospital bed to be carried into the courtroom so she could testify lying down. Her elderly mother sat in the gallery a few feet away and, throughout the testimony, said the same thing over and over, loud enough to be heard clearly by the jury. "She's a liar. She's a liar. She's a liar." Robert McCarter had spent 4 years reading every version of Jane Gibson's account. He stood up to cross-examine her with the patience of a man who had no need to hurry, who had prepared so thoroughly that the preparation itself was a kind of confidence. He read her earlier statements back to her, sentence by sentence, and asked her to explain the differences from what she was saying now. Gibson struggled with some, explained away others, held firm on the central claims. McCarter produced meteorological records, actual weather data from September 14, 1922, showing that cloud cover that night made the moonlight by which she claimed to have clearly identified faces impossible. Gibson held firm. McCarter demonstrated, using maps and the testimony of people familiar with the terrain, that the route she described riding would have required her mule to navigate ground that was impassable in darkness. Gibson held firm. But what he could not shake, he let the jury calculate for themselves. How does a memory become more specific across 4 years? How does a nighttime glimpse from the back of a mule, on a dark road, of faces she had no reason to be studying, become a certainty precise enough to name 2 defendants in a murder trial? What is the relationship between Jane Gibson's increasing certainty and the press coverage she had received, the prosecutor conversations she had participated in, the years of attention her account had generated in the years between 1922 and 1926? He never called her a liar directly. He didn't need to. He let the arithmetic speak. Jane Gibson died in 1930. She never changed her account. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 42 minutes. Not guilty. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens. Every charge. The 3 defendants left the Somerville courthouse and returned to New Brunswick, and the legal chapter of the Hall Mills case closed without answering the question it had been convened to answer. What the prosecution's theory had going for it was the brutal simplicity of obvious motive. Frances had known about the affair for years. Everyone in New Brunswick had known she knew. It was part of the ambient understanding of her situation, one of those facts that people hold carefully in conversation, never quite naming, never quite ignoring. She had absorbed that humiliation with the composure of someone who had decided that dignity required not reacting. But accumulated humiliation has a way of reaching limits that composure can't contain indefinitely. Eleanor had written to Edward with a directness that makes the letters still startling to read. In one passage preserved in trial records, she described what it meant to stand in the choir and know that he was listening specifically to her. Not to the music, not to the ensemble, but to her as a person, as a specific human presence. She wrote about what it felt like to be seen that way, to matter to someone in that particular and complete way, after years of being peripheral. The choir singer's wife, the sexton's wife, the woman nobody quite noticed. The press read those letters as scandal. What they actually were was someone telling the truth about longing, in language more honest than most people allow themselves, even in private. Francis Hall sat in a packed courtroom in November 1926 and listened to those words read aloud, and her expression didn't change. The prosecution's theory was that the staging at de Russey's Lane, the torn letters, the arranged body, the visiting card, the particular symbolic violence done to Eleanor's voice, was the communication of a woman who had finally, irrevocably, stopped holding it together. Not planned violence, not calculated murder, something that broke open and expressed itself through everything those steady hands arranged in the dark. The defense's counter was that a woman with Francis Hall's intelligence and resources, planning a deliberate killing, would not have left a scene this legible, would not have scattered letters or propped cards, would have used the considerable advantages available to a Stevens to ensure the bodies were never found, or were found somewhere that pointed away from her. The expressiveness of the scene, the argument went, pointed away from Frances precisely because it pointed so directly at her. Both readings have held their ground for 100 years, and the physical evidence that might have resolved them was destroyed by a crowd of curious civilians on the morning of September 16, 1922. The Ku Klux Klan was not, in 1922, an organization confined to the American South. It had undergone a dramatic national revival in the early 1920s, expanding into northern states with a speed that surprised the people who had assumed it was a regional phenomenon. In New Jersey, it held public rallies in fields outside cities, marching in white robes with torches, openly enough that its presence was simply a fact of the landscape in a way that is difficult to fully register from a modern vantage point. The organization's public positioning was as a moral enforcer, a corrective force for the kind of transgression that Protestant communities were supposed to police themselves and often didn't. A married minister conducting an open affair with a choir singer represented exactly the kind of moral failure the Klan publicly claimed to oppose. The theatrical quality of the Hall Mills crime scene, its deliberate symbolism, its arranged elements, the message embedded in the specific violence done to Eleanor, fits the profile of an organization that believed it was delivering righteous judgment and wanted its judgments publicly legible. But no witness ever named Klan members at DeRussey's Lane. No documentation connecting the organization to the murders has ever surfaced. The theory has been examined at multiple points across the last century and has never moved beyond the status of a serious possibility without direct evidence. In a case where the physical evidence was gone by afternoon of the first day, that may mean very little. Francis Hall died in 1942 in the Stevens family home in New Brunswick. Willie Stevens died in 1941 in the same house, still collecting butterflies, still building model trains in his dedicated room, still wandering the city he had known his entire life. Henry Stevens died in 1939. They lived out their years in New Brunswick, in the houses and routines and social structures the trial had failed to disrupt. Jim Mills outlasted all of them. He died in 1965, in his 80s, having never publicly named anyone, having spent 43 years carrying whatever he knew about the night his wife didn't come home. The crabapple tree is gone. DeRussey's Lane has been absorbed into the suburban geography of modern New Jersey. The farmland developed, the dirt road paved over, the particular landscape of the crime replaced entirely by the ordinary built environment of a region that has forgotten what happened there. There is no marker where the bodies were found, no memorial, nothing to interrupt the ordinariness of the place with the information that a man and a woman were shot to death here, and a woman was silenced in a way designed to be understood, and the message was received by everyone who needed to receive it, and no one who received it ever answered for it. What the Hall Mills case keeps returning you to, across a century, is not the question of who. It's the question of how. How an investigation dies not through dramatic interference, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions made by ordinary people with ordinary self-interest. How a crime scene gets destroyed because the people who should protect it understand, without being told, where the limits of their authority actually lie. How 4 years pass and a family continues their lives in plain sight of a community that knows, more or less, what happened and says nothing that matters. Eleanor Mills sang in the choir every Sunday morning. She had a voice people noticed. She wrote letters that told the truth about what it feels like to want something completely, and those letters were torn apart and scattered around her body as a statement about the cost of that kind of wanting. She was silenced twice, once with deliberate violence on a September night in 1922, and once by a system that decided, from the first morning, that this particular death had a particular ceiling on what it was worth pursuing. That ceiling held. It has held for 100 years. The visiting card is still in an archive somewhere in New Jersey, filed away with a case number. Undisturbed. The name on it announced to whoever found it the identity of the man who died on that dirt road, placed there by hands that were steady in the dark, communicating something that was understood by everyone and answered by no one.